Okay, today's stuff we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Hey. This week's learning is sponsored by Penina Lipsker in loving memory of Major Yaniv Kula and Staff Sergeant Itai Yavetz, both from Modi'in, who were killed in Gaza. Yaniv brought light, wisdom, and values wherever he went. Throughout his life, he acted to make the country better, and out of a deep sense of mission, he said, "Now it is my turn." Itai, charismatic and full of strength, left behind words of depth and significance, writing that the world is full of infinite meaning. May their memory be a blessing. Today's talk is sponsored by Adrian Rab Fund in honor of Joanna Ram. She's continued to push me as we study the daily daf. Happy birthday. Today's talk is sponsored by the Pearl Girls in honor of Beth Kiselev's birthday. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to get started. I'm going to do a quick review of where we ended yesterday. We're going to see actually three approaches. Maybe I'll kind of set up the daf at a glance, at least the majority of the daf. We're going to see three approaches to the mincha omer. The mincha offering of the omer, which again permits, although we're going to talk about it today exactly, does it or not, but permits the eating of the new grains. We bring it the day after the first day of Pesach on the 16th of Nisan, and that permits all the new grains of that year to be eaten. And that's, maybe I'll even read you the pasuk right now. Okay, Vayikra Kaf Gimel, which we'll get back to later. It says, Lechem v'kali v'karmel lo tochlu ad etzem hayom hazeh. Okay, don't eat from the grains. Ad haviyachem. Okay. And so now it says two things, and this is where it gets a little tricky, and you can listen to Gefet this week from Rabbani Yael Shimoni, which went up yesterday, which really talks about this topic much more in depth. So it says that Etzem Hayom Hazeh, until how exactly you describe Etzem Hayom Hazeh, until that day, okay, or the center part of that day, Ad Haviyachem et Korban Elohechem, until you bring your Korban. Okay, so that makes it pretty clear that you can't eat it until that day, and it sounds like until you bring the Korban. So what happens if you bring your korban omer that day that you're supposed to bring it, but you do it shalol lishma? So we're going to have three opinions. One is going to say, we're going to have all the extremes and in the middle. One is going to say psula, that we saw yesterday. Rav said completely disqualified. Okay, and you just have to bring a new one. We're going to have an extreme position on the other side, which is going to say you actually completely fulfilled your obligation, even though it was done shalol lishma. And then we're going to have the middle position, which is, well, it's a classic shalol lishma. It doesn't work, but it is kshera. So, let's start with it's kshera, but it doesn't really work, so you have to bring a new one. But you still go ahead and bring that sacrifice. Okay, that's basically the three opinions, and we're going to discuss them today. Now, within Rav, which was the first opinion, and that's all we've seen inside so far, he not only said that here's another case, which is, certainly didn't appear in the Mishnah. Okay, I want to just point out something about Menachot in general so far. Okay, where we started Zvachim, it was all about intent and the importance of intent, and you do something wrong, completely disqualified. Or again, not completely. We had this, right? It's fine, but this, except for in a few unique circumstances where it's completely disqualified. Menachot started out the same way, and then all of a sudden we had this radical opinion of Rabbi Shimon that said, "Oh, by the way, it actually is completely accepted." Right? So. That's right. That's one radical opinion we saw. Now, after kind of again saying there's just very few exceptions to this rule where it's completely disqualified, comes Rav, and in fact the Gemara already said this. This doesn't go with the Mishnah. This doesn't go with the Mishnah's Zvachim either. Right? All of a sudden you're bringing something new that we never heard before. Right? Now, I will distinguish between Rabbi Shimon and Rav. Rav is an Amora. Now he is early Amora, first generation, and he sometimes has the status of a Tana. And Rabbi Shimon is a Tana, but kind of things that we kind of took for granted. We're going to see another one today, another surprise one. Things that we took for granted and kind of said, this is pretty much the way things are. Machshava disqualifies. And then we said yesterday, well, according to Rabbi Shimon, if it's so wrong, possibly one way of reading Rabbi Shimon, right, it doesn't even disqualify at all. And then Rav, who is now coming and saying, it's not just those few exceptions. There's more exceptions to the rule that it's completely disqualified. Even though we didn't even hear about this at all, right? So number one, he says the mincha omer completely disqualified. Then he says also the asham mitzora completely disqualified. And that's where we got off on a tangent. The asham mitzora, the asham nazir, and I have to correct one thing I said yesterday. Well, I'll correct it in a minute when we get up to it. But the two of them, he says, are different from, let's say, asham gzelod and asham me'ilod, and that was exactly the question of the Gemara. Why are they different? These two are disqualified. The asham mitzvah, asham gzelod and me'ila, if you steal in that, then you have to bring an asham for those guilt offerings are not disqualified. Why? Because there's no point for the Asha Mitzora because it's what we call a machshir. You might say the same for Asha Me'ila. Well, it's not a machshir, it's a mechaper, and that was this whole distinction we made between sacrifices that come to atone and sacrifices that come to permit something. Okay, the mistake I meant was the asham. I said for the nazir, permits the nazir to drink wine. That's completely wrong. The asham is only brought for the nazir when he becomes impure. I just wasn't thinking about it yesterday. The chatat, right, there's 3 korbanot he brings when he finishes his nazirut. Those are the permitting ones, and those actually we're going to get to right now. But the ones he brings if he becomes impure permits him to restart his nazirut. It is a permitting. It just doesn't permit the wine drinking because it just permits him to start it again because he messed up his nazirut. It's a side point. But now our problem is, so Rabbi Yirmiyah said, oh yeah, we differentiate machshir and chapir. There are 2 different things. How do we know we differentiate? Because machshir doesn't come after someone's death, which is the same idea here. If someone dies and there's no point to bring it anymore, just like here, if it does not going to fulfill the obligation of the owner, well, there's no point to bring it. Whereas machapir is brought in cases after death, and we prove that with the ola of the yoledet. But now Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, said, what do you mean? There's also machshirin that come after death, and what are they? We ended with that. The nazir, when he brings, if you remember, if a nazir dies, but he'd already designated his money, this goes for the sin offering, this goes for the ola, this goes for the shlamim. The ola and the shlamim get brought with that money. Now wait, those are machshirin. What do those do? Those permit the nazir to drink wine, right? And yet, we bring them after death. Now, Rabbi Yirmiyah's whole thing was that's what makes the Asham Nazir, Asham Mitzvah different, because they're machshirim, because that they're not brought after death. And if they're not brought after death, then there's no point to bring this korban, and it's completely disqualified if it's done the wrong way, and it doesn't, right? It's not that the owner's dead, it's just that this korban can't work to do what it's supposed to do, just like if the owner dies. So that's where we were left off with the question. So comes Rav Papa at the bottom of Dalet Amud Bet and says, Hachi ka'amar Rabbi Yirmiyah. Lo matzinu hechsher kavua debal achar mita. He only said there's no hechsher that comes achar mita when it's the only machshir. And nazir, we're going to see, is not the only machshir, the ola and shlamim. The asham has to happen for the nazir to start counting as nizirut again once he became impure. But, right, impure to a dead body we're talking about, which he's not allowed to do. Udi nazir hechsher she'enu kavuahu. But this ola and shlamim is not considered the only way to machshir the nazir. What does the nazir have to do in order to drink wine when he's finished his process, or she's finished her process? Da amar, as somebody said, gilech alacha mishloshtan yatsa. So first of all, the nazir shaves their hair. Remember, they can't cut their hair the whole time. They shave their hair, and then they bring these 3 korbanot. But if they shave their hair and only brought 1, they actually can already drink wine. So what do you see? When we say a machshir can't be brought after death, it's only when it's the only machshir. This case is not a relevant difficulty because it's not the only machshir. And with that, we finish that difficulty. But now we have one last difficulty on Rav before we move on to the next approach. Tevet. And here's a real knockout to Rav's approach, specifically about the asham. This doesn't say anything about the mincha to omer, because remember, he talks about the mincha to omer is completely disqualified, and the asham, mitzora, and nazir, again, if they're done lo lishma, completely disqualified. But look at this braita. Asham mitzora shenishcha shelo lishmo, that's our case. The asham, the guilt offering of a leper, that's brought shelo lishmo. O shelo nitami damo al gabe behonot, or you didn't put the blood of the asham, which is supposed to go on the finger and the toe and the ear of the leper. We're going to get back to that later. We'll talk about that more in depth today. If you don't know what it is, we'll talk about it. Right now it's not so important. Hareze olel gabe mizbeach. It can still go on the altar. Okay, now, forget the dam. Okay, that's not what's important for us. The asham mitzora that was slaughtered shelo lishmo, what does it say? It goes on the mizbeach. And what did Rav say? Completely disqualified. Doesn't go on the altar. Okay, and in addition, ta'unis sechim, you bring the libations with it. Okay, that's the korban needs libations. And even though you didn't do it the right way, you still do it with the libations. But what's the story? Well, it doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner. They'll have to bring a new korban, like a classic lo lishma, tiyuvta de Rav tiyuvta. And this is a real knockout to Rav, who said it's completely disqualified. This says it's not completely disqualified. Okay, now we're back to the omer. And now we're going to see option number 2, the middle position of the omer. Not like Rav, who says it's completely disqualified if it's not shelo lishma. We're going to have the average position that you would have expected. Because why would you have expected it? Because the Mishnah says, all Menachot that nikmitzu shelo lishma ksherim, they're all good, just okay, they don't fulfill the obligation for the owner, except for the mincha chotei and the mincha knaot, right? Remember what we said yesterday. Why didn't it say this in the Mishnah according to Rav? Well, this Mishnah wasn't talking about public offerings and all sorts of other reasons why this one wasn't mentioned. But it should be in there. But the simple reading is it's not in there because it doesn't belong there, right? It's not in the list of exceptions because it's not an exception. It's the rule. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Amar, minchat omer shekmatza shelo lishma kshera. Okay, so far so good. Classic case. You bring the minchat omer, you do it shelo lishma, it's kshera, okay? But what's the problem? What does the korban omer do? We talked about this before. It permits the new grain. So what's the problem? Well, this didn't permit the new grain because it didn't work. So you have to bring a new one in its stead. And what happens in the meantime? Well, the remainder of it, now, you bring it from the new grain, okay? There's the remainder, which is supposed to go to the kohanim, but it's not permitted yet because you haven't brought the minchat omer yet. So, shiareha, the leftovers, ein echalim ad shiavim minchat omer acheret v'tatirena. Okay, very simple. You leave the leftovers until such point that later in the day, they bring a new mincha omer, sacrifice it properly, and then the shirayim can be permitted, right, at that point. Okay, very simple. Okay, so now they say, wait a minute. What do you mean, obvious point? This is a major, major problem. Why? What's the problem? Since you can't eat the remainder until you bring a new korban omer, well, that means that what? New grains are not permitted yet. If new grains are not permitted, then we have a major problem. What's the major problem? Mikrav hechi karva. How on earth do we allow this korban that was nikmatz shelo lishma? So before we burnt it, it already was disqualified, right, for doing what it's supposed to do. It doesn't permit the new grain. And then what do? We go ahead and we put the new grain on the altar at a time when new grains are not yet permitted to be eaten. This is what we call chadash asur min haTorah, right? All the new grains are forbidden until such point that you bring the korban omer. Well, what's the problem? How can you put it on the altar? It's forbidden, we're going to learn right now, to put on the altar anything that you can't eat, that's not kosher, okay? Not kosher for various reasons. In this case, it's not kosher because it hasn't been permitted yet. And how do we know that you can't do that? Mimashke Israel. Min hamutar li Yisrael. There's a pasuk from Yechezkel that talks about taking animals from mashke Yisrael, mincha la'olah l'shlamim, for korbanot. What does it mean, mashke Yisrael? From things that Jews can drink. Okay, let's say libations. Has to be wine that you can drink. You can't pour a libation with a wine that's not kosher. But not just things you can drink. It means any food that you can't eat can't go on the altar. Makes a lot of sense. So, and this is a drasha. It's not just a big sense, but this is how they darshan it. So now we have this big question, which we're going to deal with for the next while of the daf, which is, how on earth could you make? So again, you start up now. You have to say one thing. Okay, the korban omer is always brought before it's permitted. Okay, that's a big problem with this question. You always bring the korban omer according to the way we read the pasuk, right? Until you bring the korban omer, it's forbidden, right? It's forbidden to eat the new grain. So anytime you bring the korban omer, you're putting something on the altar that's forbidden. But you'd have to say one of two things. When you're bringing it, well, the Torah says you have to bring it, so we're allowed to bring it because simply the Torah says so. Or, as you're bringing it, that's the same time it's being permitted. So that's all good. But in our case, where it's not permitting anything, now you have a problem. And it's not a mitzvah anymore to bring it because you ruined the korban. So even though it's a kosher korban, how on earth are you allowed to bring it and just say, okay, well, we'll wait for the remainder to be able to be eaten, but how can you even put it on the altar? That's our big question. So make sure you get that question. Now we're going to have two answers to this question. The structure of the daf right now is going to be one answer, three difficulties on that answer. Each time we're going to resolve the difficulty except for the last one. Rav Papa is going to ask the last question. We're going to have Rav Ada brings an answer. We're going to have a different Rav Ada questioning him, Rav Sheshet questioning him, Rav Papa questioning him. Rav Papa's question is going to stand. Then Rav Papa's going to bring his own answer because he really doesn't like Rav Ada's answer and knocks it out, and therefore he brings his own answer. So the first answer is going to be this. So again, how can we bring something forbidden on the altar, something prohibited? Rav Ada bar Ahava is going to say it's not really prohibited. Why not? Rav Ada bar Ahava, kasavar Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish must hold ein mechusar zman lebo bayom. Now I want to just be clear here. We're not explaining the logic of Reish Lakish's position. What we're explaining is this difficulty within Reish Lakish. If it's not permitting anything, how could it be brought on the altar when it's forbidden to bring? And for that, we're going to explain. So it's a side question. Reish Lakish is not getting to the real root of why did Reish Lakish hold this position, but it's really just saying, how could this position make any sense if it's going to be forbidden chadash at that point? There's no way you could bring that on the altar. So he says, what does this mean? So we have to explain some terminology. Mechusar zman means something that's forbidden because its time has not yet come. Now, this is a classic case, sort of. Okay, now it's not just time that's the factor, but it could be time because you haven't done something yet. So that's exactly our case. It's mechusar zman. It's missing, right? If enough time passes and an action is done, then it will be permitted, right? Meaning later, right? So at some point, now in this case, it happens to be that day. And that's what they say. There's no problem. This is not really considered forbidden, since leid lebo bayom, ein mechusar zman lebo bayom. We don't view this as it's not yet permitted. It's mechusar zman. If it's going to be permitted later that day, and since you're going to bring the omer that day properly, therefore we don't view it right now as if chadash is asur. Now, of course, chadash is asur. You can't eat the shirayim until later. But when it comes to the altar and things that go on the altar, it's not really considered that you can't bring it yet because it will be permitted later today. That's his theory. It's a bit of a weird theory, I will admit, and that's why there are going to be some questions on it. Mativ Rav Ada braita Rav Yitzchak. So this was Rav Ada bar Ahava who brought the answer. Rav Ada braita Rav Yitzchak says, wait a minute. It can't be true what you're saying based on this braita. Okay, we're going to get a little off topic and then you'll see how they connect it. This braita compares bird offerings to meal offerings and sets up how they are different from each other. There's certain things that are relevant for bird offerings that are not for meal offerings, certain things for meal offerings that are not for bird offerings. Two people together can bring a bird offering. We could say we're going to go together and share a bird offering and we'll each pay half. You can't do that with a mincha, only an individual. Second thing, bird offerings come for people who need atonement to permit them to come into the Beit HaMikdash, or to permit them for various things, like the Zav, Zava Yoled, that we've learned about this before, the Metzora. They bring bird offerings, but they don't bring meal offerings. And Hutru Michlal Isuram Bakodesh. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, this is, they're permitted through something that's forbidden. Okay, what does that mean? Well, they're permitted, okay, to be brought on the altar only when you do an action that's actually forbidden. What is that? Malika. Malika is forbidden outside the temple. It's not, if I do malika, right, that weird way of slaughtering in the temple, if I do it outside the temple, it's actually forbidden. So they're actually permitted through something that's forbidden. Masha ein came by Menachot. Okay, again, we're totally off topic right now. You'll see in a minute how we get back. In Menachot, yesh b'menachot, what's in Menachot that aren't in, right? So none of those are true for mincha offerings. In Menachot, we have Menachot to unot kli. You have to put the mincha, the komets, in a kli, in a sanctified vessel. If you remember the blood of the bird, we just talked about this, right? You smear it on the wall, or you sprinkle it on the wall, right? The bird offerings all have different ways of doing them, okay? And then, but you don't put the blood into a vessel, okay? That's not the way the bird offerings are done. Okay, and there's tnufa. You wave the meal offering. You don't do that with the bird offerings. And hagasha, there's an actual action. You have to bring the dough, the mixture, to the altar. So none of those exist for the bird offering. And one last one. Yeshna b'tzibur k'biyachid. There's communal mincha offerings. There's, like the omer, for example. There's no communal offerings for birds. Birds are only individual offerings. Okay, masha'en came b'ofot. So what does that have to do with our topic? Well, in ita, if this were really true what you said, that which basically, what does that mean? You can actually bring something that's forbidden on the altar. Something that's forbidden outside the temple, like chadash, just like the bird, who we said malika is forbidden outside, you could do it inside. So, what do we say? It's only true for the bird offerings. That should be off the list if this is true. Because both have cases where malika is permitted on the altar even though it's forbidden outside. And the chadash is permitted on the altar even though it's forbidden outside. So, there's your, that doesn't make any sense then, right? Omer. So what do they answer? No, that's not a difficulty because it's not really forbidden. Okay, now we're going to say the following. Okay, now it's true that in reality, right now, it's forbidden outside and we're going to permit it inside. But what we're basically saying that is that since it will be permitted later today, we don't actually view this as prohibited. Whereas malika outside the temple is always going to be prohibited. You're never going to be allowed to eat a bird that you did malika to outside the temple. But this is going to be permitted later today, so we don't actually call it isur. So therefore, it wouldn't fall into the category of this term, hutru michlal isuram bakodesh. It's something that's permitted, that's forbidden outside, is going to be permitted in the kodesh. Okay, so that's not such a difficulty. Okay, moving on. Second difficulty on this theory that if it's going to be permitted that day, we view this as already as permitted, right? It's not a problem, and that's why we can put it on the altar. So mativ Rav Sheshet. Now we're going to go back to the leper, and I said we get more into the process. So a leper brings this, again, they bring a slew of korbanot. One of them is this asham. The asham we're going to learn has to be brought before the sin offering. That's something that's going to come up later. When you bring the asham, you have to do a bunch of different things. So you bring it with oil, and you have to deal with the blood of it. So the blood you sprinkle on the altar, and then you put it on the, like we said, the finger, the thumb, basically, the toe, and the ear of the leper. Then the Kohen takes oil. He takes 3 log of oil. If you remember, puts his hand, takes a handful. Okay, the remainder goes to the Kohanim. That 3 log he takes, he then, or no, maybe it's 1 log. I think it's 1 log, sorry. Anyway, he takes this log of shemen, whatever it is, he takes the amount. He takes a handful from it. Then he goes into the heichal, the sanctuary. He sprinkles 7 times. Okay, just pay attention to the order. He sprinkles 7 times toward the parochet, okay, which is towards the Kodesh Kodeshim, basically, is facing, not inside, but outside the Kodesh Kodeshim. Then he takes the oil outside, and he goes to the leper. Okay, stands, by the way, there by Shar Nikanor. That's why there's the Lishkata Mitzoraim out there. That's where the Mitzoraim stand when they do this, because they can't come in yet because they're impure. But they have to do the process kind of inside. So the Kohen stands right by the border there, and he puts also the oil on the ear and the finger and the toe of the leper. That's the order. The order is very important, we're going to see. So, Mativ Rav Sheshet. Now, the thing you have to understand like this. If the order is important and it's done out of order, what's the comparison to our case? It's basically something that's called mechusar zman. Its time has not yet come. Because if you haven't done the blood yet, you can't do the oil. So that means that if you do the oil first, and that's what we're going to talk about, if you do the oil first, and we say it doesn't work, why wouldn't it work? It's mechusar zman lebo bayom. It's something that a few minutes later will be permitted, so theoretically we should permit it now. Because what's the difference, basically? We're saying something that hasn't yet happened today should actually be fine anyway. Okay, now it's a different situation, but that's the comparison he's going to make. So he says, Hikdim, okay, and here he quotes a source again, Tanaitic source. Hikdim matan shemen lematan dam. If you put the oil first before the blood, what do? It's no good, the shemen. So you have to redo the oil. You start from the beginning. Yimal enu shemen, you fill up the oil again to the amount that you need. V'yachzor v'yitein shemen achar matan dam. And then you do the blood again, right? Or if you had done the blood already, so you did it. That doesn't matter. Or you do it now. And then you go back and do the oil. Matan behonot lematan sheva. If you put, right, if you did the behonot, you put it on the behonot before you put it. Okay, thanks for telling me. It's 1 log, okay? If you put the behonot before you did the matan sheva, let's say you take the oil, and before you sprinkle the 7 times, you actually put it on the leper first. You have to redo the stage that was supposed to be second. Now again, this is what I said before. If you say, right? If we say it doesn't matter if it can be done later, and it's fine if it was done now, basically, right? It's not a problem. So what you did, and it should be fine. Since it could be done later, it kind of makes it permitted to be done now. So Rav Papa said that is not a problem. Why is that not a problem? Because that is for a different reason completely. There's nothing to do. Maybe you could still say, but here's an exception to the rule. Why? Because Rav Papa says, Shani Hochot Mitzorah, Diktivu Havaya. Based on a pasuk where the word says Tihiyeh, we're going to learn that it has to be done exactly in that order. So it has nothing to do with our topic. Okay, Da'amar HaKatuv, Zot Tihiyeh Torat HaMetzorah, right? Usually the case there, right? Zot Torat HaMincha, we just had that, right? Zot Torat HaChatat. Why does it say Zot Tihiyeh Torat HaMetzorah? This will be the rules for the Metzorah. Tihiyeh V'Havayatate. Has to be exactly the way it's supposed to be. So that's an exception to the rule, and that doesn't prove anything about the rule. Mativ Rav Papa. But now comes Rav Papa, and he brings the real question. Higdim, now it's going to sound very similar. Higdim chatato la'ashamo. What if you accidentally did the sin offering before the guilt offering? He has to bring he brings the I think he brings an ola anyway, and a chatat and an asham. So if he's supposed to bring the asham first, what if he brings the chatat first, but he slaughters it first? Okay, he didn't do the rest of it. Lo yihiyeh acher memares b'dama. You don't say, okay, find someone to just mix the blood. Remember, we're always worried to stir the blood so that it doesn't coagulate. But you don't say that. Ela ti'ubar tzurata v'tisei lebeit hasrefa. That chatat's completely disqualified. Wait till it gets disqualified. Okay, some people say that means wait till overnight. Some people say wait till it already looks like it gets so ruined that it's disgusting looking. And then burn it. Okay, it's ruined because you did it out of order. Now here comes our question again. So now, what's the question? They don't even say it. It's obvious what the question is. If then who cares about the order? Now this is a bit of a weird question that Rav Papa is answering, because Rav Papa just said a minute ago, Zot Tiyeh Torah Mitzorah has to be done in that order. So the Gemara says, Amai kamotiv Rav Papa. Why is he asking this question? Ha Rav Papa hu da'amal. He's the one who just said, Shani hochom Mitzorah dichtiv bu'avaya. Okay, so he just said it has to be done in this order. There's no. Ela Rav Papa, hachi kakashile. Ama ema hanemile avoda. When it says Zot Tiyeh Torah Mitzorah, it has to be done in that order. What's that talking about? The main rituals of the sacrifice. Remember, we've always talked about this. Avoda is different. Shchita is different. Shchita is not an avoda. How do we know it's not an avoda? Because it doesn't have to be done by a Kohen. So, shchita lav avodahi. And we were talking about you slaughtered the sin offering before the right time. Now, that shouldn't be a disqualifying factor because Zot Tiyeh Torah Mitzorah. Zot Tiyeh Torah Mitzorah is once you're done with the shchita, all the things relating to the blood, that has to be done, and the oil in this case. That has to be done in the proper order. But the shchita, the fact that you slaughter the chata first, as long as you sprinkle the blood after, you're fine in terms of your order. So, therefore, he asks the question now, because if it's not an avoda and it's not part of that pasuk, Zot Tiyeh Torah Mitzorah, then we're really back to the question. If it's not avoda, the shchita, so it doesn't really matter the order, and so maybe it does matter for this other reason, but since you could bring it later, it's as if it's fine that you did it now. So it's fine you slaughtered it now. So just mix the blood, do the asham first, and then come back and do it. But we see that you can't. So it seems to disprove this theory that So Ella Amar, Rav Papa says, fine, I can't accept this answer. I'm going to give a different answer for Reish Lakish. Okay, and again, we're trying to answer the question. Let's just review. We're trying to answer the question, how can we bring the korban omer when chadash is asur? If we're not fulfilling our obligation of permitting the omer, and the omer is not yet permitted, then how on earth can we bring this? This is forbidden food. So we tried to say that Reish Lakish holds it's not really forbidden because we don't view things as forbidden if it hasn't yet come their time, but their time is going to come later that day. Okay? If there's not going to be that day, then yes, they'll be forbidden, but this one is going to be permitted later, so we'll already say it's like permitted now for the altar. But we knock that out right now because then the chatat should have been valid and we shouldn't leave, right? You always want to avoid destroying kachim and leaving this chatat to be burned. So the fact that we don't allow it seems to say this isn't right. Ela Amar Rav Papa, Hainu Tama de Reish Lakish, de Kasaval Heir Mizrach Matir. Here comes again something radical. He says the reason for Reish Lakish is that as soon as the sun rises on the eastern horizon, as soon as you see the sun on the eastern horizon, he permits it. Okay? Right? This is, right, when it comes over to the east, you can, our sun is already on the east side, that permits the omer. What do you see here? Going back to that pasuk, ad etzem hayom hazeh. Not ad she'aviyat hakorban, okay? Now, you have to understand the pasuk. It says two things. Until you bring your korban. It's not dependent on the korban. It's dependent on a time factor. So you're bringing this korban after that time. So if you bring the korban after that time, it's permitted. It's not even forbidden at all. Okay? That's a radical approach, although maybe not so radical. And you can listen to Reniel Shimoni about how to understand this. How do you read the pasuk then, right? That maybe it's just ideally you should bring the korban before you permit the chadash. And that, by the way, is why chadash is permitted today on the 16th, because we don't have a korban to permit it, right? Theoretically, we should never be able to permit the new grains, right? But, okay. So that's where he explains it to Rabbi Yochanan of Reish Lakish. And then he says, and by the way, I'm not just making this up to explain Reish Lakish, but Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish actually both say this. To Amrei Travayo, they both say, Afilu bisman shebeit hamikdash kayam. Now, you might have thought, okay, maybe what I said about nowadays is only when there is no temple. Even when the temple exists, turning out Amid Bet, Hi'ir Mizrach Matir. Okay, that permits it. Now, V'ha de Reish Lakish lav beferish itmar. But now the Gemara is telling you, by the way, what he says wasn't said explicitly, ela michlala itmar. It was derived from something else he said. Doesn't mean he didn't say it, but basically we're going to tell you how we know Reish Lakish said this. Well, Ditnan, there was a Mishnah that says, and there's a bit of a girsa problem with this Mishnah, I'm going to read it the way it was corrected. Ein mivi'im minachot, you don't bring minachot, or bikurim, mincha be'ema, or the libations that go together with the animal, the sacrifices, kodem la'omer. You can't bring, now what they mean is from the new grains. Okay, bikurim were brought from the Shivat HaMinim. Right, we're getting to Rosh Chodesh Shvat, right? The 7 species. So two of them are wheat and barley, right, which are part of the chadash. So you don't bring bikurim, you don't bring the mincha be'ema, the mincha that goes with that, and you don't bring regular menachot before the korban omer from the new grains. V'imivi. Now, if you were to bring a korban before it was permitted before the omer, imevi pasul, it would be disqualified. Kodem l'shtei alechem lo yavi. Now, before you bring the sacrifice. Now, here we're going to learn something interesting. You're actually allowed to eat chadash, but you're still not really allowed to bring it on the altar until Shavuot, when you bring the shtei alechem. V'im hevi kasher, but between the time of the omer until the time of Shavuot, it's less severe. If you were to do it, the korban's accepted. Okay, if you do it from the new grain before the omer is permitted, it's completely disqualified. If you do it between the Pesach, basically between the 16th of Nisan and Shavuot, it's permitted. It's, accepted even though you shouldn't do it. Now, here's what Reish Lakish said, and from there they're going to derive this halacha, the Hi'ir Mizrach. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Reish Lakish, Lo shanu ela ba'arba'asar or b'chamishasar. It's only on the 14th or the 15th. Aval b'shishasar im hevi kasher. But on the 16th, if he brought it's kasher. Now, what do you see? He said it all depends on the date. That shows it doesn't depend on the bringing of the sacrifice. Alma kasavar hi'ir mizrach matir. Therefore, it must be, he thinks, it's when the sun illuminates things on the eastern side of the horizon, then it permits. Okay, that was Reish Lakish. So what we did in that section, again, we started with Rav, who said completely disqualified if you do it lo lishma. We have Reish Lakish. I'm going to today summarize while we're doing it and not at the end. We have Reish Lakish, who says it's basically shelo lishma. We're going to say it's the classic case. It's kasher, but it doesn't permit. You don't fulfill your obligation, which means it doesn't permit the korban, right? The new wheat, which is why the shirayim have to be left. But then we say, well, how then can you bring it on the altar? Isn't that a problem? So they say, well, for the altar, either we say it's actually not really considered forbidden in terms of the altar because it's going to be permitted later today, so we can allow it on the altar. Or in the end, we say, actually, Hi'ir Mizrach already permits, it's not the korban that permits. Now, you'd have to say the korban still has to be brought in order to permit the shirayim, because that's what he says, right, the remainder. But for the altar, that's sufficient already. Okay, now comes Rava's position, the third on the other extreme. Rava Amar, Minchat omer shekmatzah shelo lishma, kshera u'shi'aleh ne'achalim. It's completely permitted, right? It's completely kosher, and it actually does what it's supposed to do. You don't even have to bring a new korban omer. Why is this? Now, again, I talked about finding radical positions, especially after we spent so much time about how important intent is. Well, he says, She'en machshava mo'elet. Machshava is not effective to ruin a korban in the following three cases. Okay, or only in the following three cases it's going to be relevant. Ela b'misha ru'uya lavoda. It has to be someone who is supposed to do the avoda. We're going to talk about what all these things mean in a minute. B'davar hara'u'el lavoda was something that's appropriate to use for worship. U'b'makom hara'u'el lavoda. And in a location or a place, we're going to see exactly what they mean by that, that's proper to do the avoda. What it basically means is, and by the way, we did kind of learn this about pigul. If something else was messed up, right, was disqualified for some other reason, pigul doesn't mess up, so maybe it's not as radical as I was saying, but basically it's going to limit the amount of times that machshava can actually ruin a korban, kind of like Rabbi Shimon. So what's b'misha ra'oi lavoda? Lafuke kohen ba'amum. That comes to exclude a blemish kohen. If a blemish kohen did the avoda with a machshava to ruin it, we ignore it. U'b'davar hara'oi lavoda. Lafuke mincha omer de lo chazia de chidushu. Okay, he says the mincha omer is actually not the right way to go on the mizbech. Why not? Well, Rashi says the problem is it's made from barley. Now, barley is usually considered animals' food. You'll see all throughout the Gemara we talk about barley bread is disgusting and it's not healthy and it's just not respectful food. So you wouldn't bring something that's not respectful food on the altar unless the Torah told you to. So because it's a chidush, the Torah said bring it, but you're not really supposed to bring it. So a machshava doesn't ruin a korban omer at all. That's pretty radical. If you put it on an altar that's ruined, so that's not a location or a place. So I said it's not exactly a location, like physical location, but it's a place that's not a proper place to get it to sacrifice. Okay, and that finishes our sugya of that part of today's daf, which is those three opinions. Okay, very interesting, the range of opinions about what happens with the korban mincha to omer. Specifically, that was done shalol lishma. Now we're going to go to another braita, and you'll see later this is going to connect to the omer, and that's probably why the sugya is here. Tanu Rabbanan. Keshuhu omer mina bakar lamata she'en talmud lomar. We're dealing with Vayikra, first chapter, verse 3. In verse 2, it already says, if you bring a korban ola from the behemah, from the this, it says from this 3 times, okay, from the bakar, from the tzon, okay, from cattle, from sheep. Now, every time you say min, we've learned this many times, it means from, it means not all. You can't bring all of them. So it starts already with drashot on those 3 words in pasuk bet, saying, oh, min behemah comes to exclude if it would engage in bestiality, and min bakar comes to exclude if it was worship for avodah zarah, and minat tzon comes to say if it was designated for avodah zarah. Okay, and there's all sorts of limit. They say, not this, not that, not that. But then the next pasuk says mina bakar again. So what is that extra mina bakar coming? To which the braita says it comes to teach you. It ain't talmud lomar. You don't need that pasuk again. Those words again. Ela lo tziyat treifa. It's to come and tell you can't put a treifa, an animal that's sick and that dies soon. However you define a treifa, there's all different machloket. We'll spend a long time on that in chulin, so we'll wait for then. But treifa can't go on the altar. Now, Gemara said, the braita continues and says, "Halo dinu." Well, I don't need a pasuk to tell me that. It's pretty logical. That what? Well, ma baal mum. Here's a kal v'chomer. A baal mum, a blemished animal, mutar lehedyot. A regular person can eat a blemished animal, right? I can go to the store, go to the butcher, buy an animal that was blemished. I don't check was the animal blemished before. It's only an issue for the korban, right? For the mizbech. Asur legavoah. So it's permitted to a regular person, and yet it's forbidden on the altar. So treifa, right? If I go to the butcher and I want to get a treifa, I can't. It's forbidden to eat. So asura lehedyot, it's forbidden outside the temple. So wouldn't you say, Eino din, if I can't eat it, and this, by the way, goes with that Mashkei Yisrael. We're going to talk about that later. Okay? The Gemara is going to ask at the end of this whole sugya, didn't we learn this from Mashkei Yisrael, not from this pasuk? Okay, but let's get there later. So, treifa shasura lehedyot, Eino din shasura legavoah. So if a treifa is forbidden to a regular person, of course you can't put it on the altar. But they say, no, forget that kal v'chomer. Why? I'm going to disprove this kal v'chomer from the chelev and dam. Those are the fats and the bloods. That what do we know about them? You can't eat the fats of an animal. You can't eat the blood of an animal. Well, asurim lehedyot, and yet, what do we do with the chelev? We burn it on the altar. What do we do with the blood? We put it on the altar. Umutarim legavoah. Those two are actually forbidden outside and permitted inside. So you can't say just because something's forbidden outside, it means it's permitted inside. These are exactly, it can't be forbidden inside like the treifa. Maybe it's permitted. So they say, no, those have an exception. There's a reason why they're permitted inside, or there's a leniency about them. What's the leniency? Well, the chelav and dam might be forbidden outside, but the rest of the animal is actually permitted. It's just those parts. But tomar b'treifa, shekula asura, you can't compare that to a treifa, where the whole animal is completely forbidden. Okay, so let's try another knockout to the kav chomer. So we're back to our kav chomer, because we can't use this as an example. So we have a blemished animal. It's permitted outside and yet forbidden inside. So the treifa, it's forbidden outside, must be forbidden inside. Malika tochiach, shekula isur, vasura lehedyod, muteret legavoa. Well, Malika will prove, because it's completely forbidden outside, Malika, that we talked about this earlier, and yet it's permitted inside. No. And therefore, maybe you could say the same as treifa, forbidden outside, permitted inside. Mala Malika, shekin kedushata sarta. No, Malika is not, the bird isn't forbidden until you do Malika, and the moment you do Malika, you basically sanctify the animal, the bird. So the sanctification happens at the same time that you do the Malika. That has a uniqueness about it. That basically what is forbidden outside is what actually causes the sanctification to be put on this animal. So that's a unique law, and therefore you can't learn from there to right. Hina eseret lehedyot ahaynu malikata. Right. Skip these parentheses, but you can read it. B'shak kedushat mizbeach. That's when she becomes forbidden outside, and which is its malika. But it wasn't forbidden before to anyone, and it's only forbidden at the time that you actually sanctify it. So that makes it a unique case. You can't learn from there to treifa. So what are we left with? We're left with our kav chomer. So now we have a problem. So what do you need the pasuk for? If we knocked out all the attempts to knock out the kav chomer, so now comes this not big line, very short line, that causes a big halabaloo, that we're going to continue into the next daf, which is v'im heshavta. But still, if you tried some other way to knock out that kav chomer without getting into details, how? Which is what begs the question, well, how could you have knocked out the kav chomer? We tried, we didn't succeed, so what are you talking about? Im heshavta, if you had some other response to the kav chomer, kishu omer min bakar lamata she'en tom l'lamar lo siyat hatrefa. Okay, so if you were to knock out the kav chomer, that's why we need the pasuk. So it's a very weird braita. It basically says, there's a pasuk to teach you, treifa can't go on the altar. You might have thought it was a kav chomer. And then you say, well, maybe not. Oh, no, but we're left with maybe is. So then what do you need the pasuk for? Well, they say, in case you came out with some other way to knock out the kav chomer. So the Gemara is obviously going to say, my imei shavta. What are these possible knockouts to the kav chomer? So now we're going to start, we're going to, in the end, have 6 explanations. We're going to get to 5 and 6 tomorrow. Today we're going to do 1 through 4. Amar Rav, mishum de'ika l'meimar, and now you're going to see why we're here, mincha omer tochiach. The mincha omer, because why? It's asura lehedyod muteret legavoa. It's basically taking chadash, which is forbidden outside the, right now it's forbidden, and we allow it on the altar. So there's a good example. Malam mincha omer shekem materet chadash. No, mincha is permitted on the altar. Why? Because it permits chadash. It has a unique purpose. That's why we let it on the altar, not because treifa, which is forbidden outside, let's just say, we'll let it inside. So they say, what about b'shvi'it in the Shemitah year when it doesn't permit anything because you're not allowed to eat it from the new crop on the Shemitah year? Shvi'it nami, shekem materet tzvichim b'shvi'it. They say, no, even then it has a matir. Why? On the Shemitah year, when you bring the korban omer, and we're going to say, well, maybe we shouldn't allow it that year because it doesn't do anything, right? If the whole thing is it permits something. Well, it permits things that grow in the wild. Okay, we're going to continue question. Rabbi Akiva, Damar Svicha Nasurim B'Shvi'it. Rabbi Akiva says you can't even eat things that grow in the wild on Shemitah, as opposed to things you planted, right? So, and then it really has no purpose. No, Amalei Rav Achabar, Abel Rav Ashi Rabbi Akiva Nami Lifroch. You can still knock it out. Malam Chata Omer Shekem Ateret Chadash B'Chutz La'aretz. There's Isra Chadash also in Chutz La'aretz, and there's no prohibition of Shemitah, so it permits what goes on in Chutz La'aretz. Va'afil L'man Damar Chadash B'Chutz La'aretz Lav D'Oraita. There's big machloket. Is Chadash outside of Israel D'Oraita or D'Rabbanan? Even if you say it's not D'Oraita, it does have another purpose. Shekem Ba'ala Tir Lav Shebetocha. Now, chadash is aser, and it's aser to go on the altar. But by sacrificing it, you're actually permitting it, the prohibition to use chadash, you're permitting it in that moment for itself. So there's no isur lotas say now on the mincha omer. This, by the way, means that the shirayim aren't forbidden by a lotas say. Now, you're still not supposed to eat them because they're chadash, but there's no, if you did eat them, if the kohen ate the shirayim, he wouldn't get punished for it. Okay. So anyway, it is matir, something in every, somehow you could always find something that's matir, and therefore it's not a difficulty. So, Amar le Rav Acha, midifti le Ravina, ihachi trefanami tikra v'tatir lav shebetocha. Well, maybe you should say the same thing. It's a crazy thing to think about. But take a treifa, put it on the altar. Maybe it permits the lo taseh in the treifa. You can't eat a treifa. Maybe once you put it on the altar, it kind of has this magical power to undo the lo taseh. Okay, so they say forget that. But ela parichachi. But you could say this then. In other words, theoretically, if you were to learn from the omer, but you can't learn from the omer. Why? For a very simple reason. And this is going to be the response to the first 5 answers. Why is it permitted on the altar? Because there's a mitzvah to put it on the altar. You're supposed to take from the new grain and put it on the altar according to the Torah. Okay? There's no mitzvah to put a treifa on the mizbeach. And that's why you can't use this as a knockout. Okay, so let's try attempt number 2. Reish Lakish amar. Mishum de'ikal amemar mifatem aktoret yochiach. Each time we're going to bring a case of something that's permitted outside, forbidden outside, permitted inside. And that's going to knock out the Baal Mum, right? Because we're trying to go permitted outside and yet forbidden inside. So forbidden outside is going to definitely forbidden inside. But if we can take a case where things are permitted inside and they're not outside, we can disprove. But every time we're going to say, but that's the way to do the mitzvah, and it doesn't relate at all to the treifa. So Reish Lakish says, you could say the person who prepares the incense. I am not allowed to prepare an incense in my own house. I can prepare incense in the temple. So there you have an example. Mifatem ketoret, the one who makes the ketoret. Asur lehedyot, you can't do it at home, right? Don't try this at home. But mutar legavah, but you can do it for gavah. So they say mifatem gavrahu. That's a person. We're talking about things that go on the altar. People don't go on the altar. We're not talking about that. Not people. That's not what we're talking about. Okay, fine. So I'll fix it. Ela pitum ketoret yochiach. Offering the incense, asur lehedyot, you can't offer the ketoret in your house, but, right, this special ketoret that was made for the temple, but mutar the gavah. Okay, so they say, no, malapitum ketoret came as fatabakach. No, that's the way to do the mitzvah. You can't derive from that anything to treifa. Third attempt. Mar braita Ravina, mar mishum deikalamei mar Shabbat tochiach. Asura lehedyot muteret legavah. Shabbat, you're allowed to do sacrifices on Shabbat in the temple, but you can't slaughter animals outside the temple, so yet here you see something's permitted. No, but Shabbat has some other heter, maybe because of that, because you could do a brit milah, and that's for regular people, not temple. Say, wait a minute. You're saying a brit milah is a fascinating line, but not for today. A brit milah is for people? What do you mean? Milah mitzvahi. It's a mitzvah. It's for God, really. So that doesn't count. But wait, it's a mitzvah to bring all those sacrifices on Shabbat. That's why it's permitted. So that didn't help us with treifa. Rav Ada bar Abba amar, 4th attempt, mishum de'ikal amemar kilayim yochichu. Shatnez. Why? Surim lehedyot, you can't wear shatnez, but the big day kohen were shatnez. Okay, mutarim legavah. So they say, no, malak kilayim, shekenu trumi chalani etzel hedyot b'tzitzit. They are permitted to regular people for tzitzit. But you know where this is going? Tzitzit, atu tzitzit, sorach hedyotu? What, people wear tzitzit for their own sake? What do you mean? It's mitzvahi. That's for a mitzvah we permit it, not for regular anything. Ella, so what's the knockout though? Ella malak kilayim shemitzvah tabakach. Kilayim, that's its mitzvah. The kohen, big day kohen, have to be made of kilayim, so that doesn't help you at all. Okay, so we're still trying to figure out how to knock out that kavach omer. So the first part of the daf was those 3 opinions about the omer shelo lishma. This part was trying to figure out what this braita is talking about. How could you have possibly knocked out that kavach omer and thought that maybe a treifa was allowed on the altar? And because of that, you need a pasuk. We're trying to figure out why you can knock it out from where. We haven't yet succeeded. Well, wait till tomorrow's daf, and then you'll figure out how we finally figure out how to knock out that kavach omer. That we finished for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.